Good morning. We're back with the panel for Q&A. Thank you all for staying with us. And we have a special guest, which is Ed. We weren't sure he was going to stay, but I think he had such a ball doing the first part of it that he's here. Again, the guests are Kara Madoff Barnett, Andrea Sullivan, Suhair Khan, and Ed Basie, Lord Ed Basie. So my first question is going to go to all of you, which is, what roles do you think the board and executive team play in finding the balance between the short-term needs and the long-term growth? Andrea, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. I think you mentioned some of these areas in your closing remarks, the three things that you got out of the last session. You know, I sit on numerous arts boards and other boards over the years. I think the most important thing that the board can do is have the vision for the future and enable the management team to have a license to fulfill that plan. Often we get short-term tracked, which is understandable, especially when finances are tight. But, you know, really encouraging the investment in what the future of the organization is going to look like, because it takes time to get there, right? Building a digital platform or creating new products. So I think that's the key thing. And some of that backs up to making sure that you have long-term partnerships, if you can, with funders, so that you have the ability to know that there's going to be some surplus coming in, that you can do some of these big projects. So that would be the first advice that I couldn't think of.
Ed, how about, I know you're on a number of boards these days. Speaking as a board member, what do you think the board and executive team can do in finding the balance between this kind of short-term needs for the orgs, but also the long-term growth?
Well, I think the board, to a certain extent, needs to know its place. I think too many boards try to take over the role of the chief executive and set the short-term goals, the long-term goals, the strategy for the organization. You know, a board is there to supplement and support the chief executive. Their most important role is actually to choose the chief executive and then to bring particular expertise to the board, whether that is financial expertise or marketing expertise, which can add to the tool set of the chief executive. I bring absolutely zero expertise to a board, so it's always fun to see what I can contribute. But I think you know, you would rely on a good chief executive both to be highlighting short-term problems where the board can come in and support, but also setting a long-term strategy. And obviously the long-term strategy is, I think, probably where the board is the most useful, because you are, excuse the pun, the sounding board for that chief executive. That's your moment, I think, to challenge in a good way the chief executive's vision for the organization. By the way, apart from Susan, who's obviously the most formidable board member I've ever met, I would recommend that you read John Chusser's book called On Board, which is all about John Chusser, but it's also about John Chusser's experience on a variety of different boards. And it's a challenging role in board, but I think ultimately it's hard to distinguish between short and long term. Short, you're there, emergency is too strong a word, you're there to help out with a particular initiative. Long term, you're there to help the chief executive realize their vision and challenge. But you have to, I think, always remember that it is the chief executive's organization, as it were, it's the chief executive and the team's organization. It's not your organization. And if you fundamentally disagree with the chief executive, then it's either time for you to get off the board or to get the chief executive out of the organization.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Ed. And I'm moving over to Suhair now to ask the same question. And it's interesting, actually, as I look at our group of panelists, Andrea Sullivan brought me onto my first board. Thanks for doing that, sister. Suhair, moving on to you.
Yeah, so I think this year has taught me a lot more about what a board can do. For a few of the organizations I'm involved with, there's been a lot more just the idea of supporting mental health, well-being of the chief executive of the teams. of some of the organizations that I've been working with have felt just much more important than ever. Dealing with crisis, I think a lot of these leaders have not had that support for themselves. So I've been surprised that actually it's been a really wonderful opportunity to have a group of people who've been able to provide, as Ed said, a sounding board, but also sort of someone that they can turn to when things are feeling really tough, or even just a check-in. I think most people have been really stoic, but I haven't had that group of people to say, I'm struggling with this. I've had to furlough my staff. We're applying for this Arts Council funding. We don't know if we're going to get it or not. So I think the role of empathy, compassion, and support has been greater than I had seen in the past, obviously. The second thing is in terms of long-term thinking. So as somebody who's coming from the tech world, for me, I've always seen my role as somebody supplying new ideas, new insights, and new introductions. The world of dance or culture or online news, media, activism, all of this, I think there's a space that, I fill, which is here are new ways of thinking. Again, I really push the idea of diversity in thought and bringing new kinds of partnerships and collaborators forward as ideas. But to Ed's point, these are, you can suggest, you can support, and that's it. You're there to supplement rather than to replace any functions in an organization.
Thanks, Suhair. And as I move over to Kara, if one of my team members can maybe put into the chat line, there's actually a series we run with New Role. As you all know, they're one of the headhunters that do it purely digitally. And we do look at this, the folks who serve on both, the nonprofit and the private sector boards and their kinds of thoughts. Everyone from Dame Mary Archer through to William Eccleshare have been interviewed, to Lord Brown. But moving over to you, Kara.
Sure. So I love two of the words I heard, and one was from Suhair, which was empathy. And we it is so meaningful and so gratifying and so tremendously helpful as an executive director to have empathy and support from our board, not only financial support, but also just understanding of what it means to lead an organization through crisis. And then the other is expertise. And I think that during this time of rapid evolution and rapid change and digital transformation, having someone like Suhair on your board is game changing. And it's something, frankly, that we don't have at American Ballet Theatre right now, that expertise from tech, from digital. And it's not only the expertise, but it's also the networks. And you mentioned introductions, Suhair, and you earlier, Susan, on the panel mentioned the expectations of management and of staff to experiment and to embrace digital. And so having members of your board who have not only digital expertise, but also the digital networks to make those introductions and to help us with digital content creation, with digital content distribution, and to accelerate the pace of change, to accelerate the opportunities and to expand the opportunities for digital innovation, that would be crucial. And I find that so many individuals who have leadership experience in digital and tech are either not serving on boards or perhaps serving on boards for nonprofit organizations that are not necessarily in the art and cultural space. I think that there's this feeling of kind of either or, right? No, education is my thing or the environment is my thing. And I just wish that more tech executives would think expansively about the ways that they can impact society and perhaps participate in additional causes and areas, including arts and culture, not to turn their back in any way on health or education or social causes, but to embrace art and culture as part of their philanthropic portfolio and the ways in which they can accelerate positive change in our world.
Thank you. And Suhair, you touched on that we're moving into this kind of hybrid model towards monetization, but long term, and I ask this of all of you guys, but I want to start with Suhair. Long term, how do you see our sector, this sector, adapting their businesses to these changing patterns of digital engagement and consumption? How do you see that changing?
So I can't speak to the donor model because I've not been directly involved. I think there's just going to be different kinds of donors. I think everybody's talked about companies that are seeking to support arts and culture because they believe in it, because they believe it's good for to showcase what they represent. It's probably good for their own staff and employees to engage in that space more. And I also think that culture is going to have more and more power, as you look at kind of the world shifting than ever before. So I think there will be the donor model there. But as I said earlier, I think you're going to have a lot more of direct partnerships, museums acting as thought leaders, museums supplying their intellectual capital to organizations, whether private or public around the world, working with a more global set of partners and institutions. I don't think the core of what any of these cultural institutions represents is going to change in the short term. At the end of the day, the Zeitsmoka in Cape Town will still have an incredible contemporary art collection, and that's going to remain, what they represent as an organization. How they showcase their work will change. There'll probably be more digital content created, but how they lean into digital platforms is going to just become much more central to the future of how they work and engage. And in the very long term, it's very hard for anybody to say what happens in the world. I don't think we're not going to visit Petra, if we can. I don't think we're not going to come and see a performance of the American Ballet Theatre if we could. And so I think we are going to come back to this fundamental desire to connect, engage, to buy a ticket and to go. But equally, I think there's going to be room for new ways of monetizing for a global audience.
Does anyone else want to dive into that? Look into the crystal ball. What do we see?
I just say that I agree with everything that Suhair just said. Well, all of you. But the other thing I think we're seeing is even when the pandemic's over, I think for a while people are going to stay closer to home. They are going to build more of a life in their own community rather than traveling 40 minutes or an hour to have their life be in the big city potentially. And I think that allows the relationships with communities and the arts organizations to be rethought and further developed. I just think we're going to have other hubs, and that's great because digital can help service that. But it also can bring real to life art in your own hometown. And that, I think, is something we've needed to see, that diaspora and funding, if we can get it into those areas. So I think that we're going to see a bit of a change.
I think there are potentially lots of missed opportunities that are arising. By the way, Susan, I have actually read your New Role interviews. Amazingly, I never normally read that kind of stuff, but they are annoyingly very good. So I've started reading them in order to train myself on how to be a better board member. But I think that to pick up really on what Andrew was saying, I think that this is a sort of more general point about COVID. I think we've lived the last 6 months on the assumption that it's all going to end, that it's, the parallel with the war is obvious and it's all over by Christmas, that somehow come December or something, that's it, it's just gone, everyone goes back to normal. And I fully confess I was one of those people. I think we're now in a position where we have to think this is going to fundamentally change the way we live and work for the next 2-3 years, who knows how long. And I think some of the missed opportunities are, first of all, partly from government, to really engage with the arts about how you put on performances in a COVID era, either inside a building, COVID safe, or actually outside, filling our parks with makeshift pop-up theatres and performance spaces. I was talking to somebody the other day, why not railway concourses? Since transport is down so much, you've got these vast concourses which are probably a third full. So to really lean in and say we need live performance, let's find a new way of doing this because we can't do it the normal way. The second thing, which I think, again, I'm picking up on what Andrea said, is about community. The government's put a lot of money into keeping people in work, but it hasn't thought about, I think Cara was talking about ballet performances for people. Why aren't we thinking about people performing in care homes, maybe too dangerous a place, but in hospitals and so on, and the government paying our performers, our freelancers who are on their knees, to do impromptu performances, performing outside a hospital, so that even if the patients can open their windows and listen and hear, those kind of they would be optimistic, they would be exciting, they would be different. they would be engaging a whole new audience who unfortunately are flat on their back in a bed perhaps. But none of that is happening. None of that, an entirely separate discussion for an entirely separate time about the arts' role in criminal justice, in education, in health. All of that could be being exploited now during this pandemic.
Absolutely. And did someone else want to add to this around the long term? I mean, Cara, I'm hearing what Ed's saying, and I'm thinking about these NBA, that's the National Basketball Association, to everyone who's not from America. Can you talk to us about what you guys are doing along those lines?
Sure. So we're looking at new models of how to create during this time, and ballet being a collaborative art form, that's not so easy. We think about how it's hard to have public assembly for audiences, but what about for artists who actually need to be together in the same space in order to create new work, right? And they need a choreographer and multiple artists to be able to touch one another and to be able to breathe the same air. So we've actually taken inspiration from the National Basketball Association, which had a quarantine bubble in Florida that was tremendously successful, and they were able to play playoff games and reach their fans nationwide and worldwide. And so we actually right now have 3 quarantine bubbles, including one which is ABT Studio Company, so supported by Bank of America. Thank you, Andrea and Rena and everyone at Bank of America. But we are creating through crisis. We have up to 14 dancers and choreographers and faculty and artistic staff in these bubbles, where for 2 weeks they're having their COVID tests and they're staying separate, and they're doing individual training, but then they get to take off their masks and they get to actually collaborate and create new work, which will then, for now, capture digitally and share over various platforms. But eventually, maybe, Ed, to your point, maybe we can find exciting places outdoors where we can also provide a live experience to a socially distanced audience. And then once we are able to convene audiences once again, we'll have new stories told, new stories that are created by choreographers who are willing to go with us on this adventure and go into those bubbles and participate in this collective experience of creation, so that it's not only the solo novelist or the solo painter sitting in their studio who's able to create right now, but also we're able to collaborate in groups to tell new stories.
So I want to thank you, Cara, and I want to draw on what Ed was saying about the individual kind of creative professional. We have a question that came in from Deepika Srivastava, who's a student at the VNA and getting her MA in the history of design. And she asks, how does the change in revenue models and the digitalization of cultural content respond to the needs of institutions versus the needs of the individual artists and how they work together? So can we move over to that? And I think it's interesting because on a panel we did a few months ago, Kwame Kwei-Armah, the wonderful Kwame Kwei-Armah from the Young Vic, was talking about this new word. It's not interdisciplinary, it's anti-disciplinary. So if you look at someone like Susie Wakoma, Susie is starring in something in Netflix as an actor, but she's also writing things and she's producing things. And Susie's not just one thing, Susie's a lot of things, right? But going back to what Deepika's asking, how will there be a change in revenue models with the individual? Cara, can I go to you first? Because it seems like you've got individuals and you've got the company.
Sure. So I think that I love that word anti-disciplinary. I think that this is a time where artists do not want to be limited by one discipline, by one genre, by one art form. We actually just released the first ever ABT Short Film Festival, where we invited dancers to go behind the camera and to make their own short films. And we were astonished by the creative output. And most of these dancers had never made a film before, had never edited a film before. And they are such talented storytellers in a variety of media. Several of our dancers are making music videos. Some of them are, we found that some of them are incredible painters and visual artists. And so we also are inviting them to collaborate with artists from other genres, because we find that that's a way to test these boundaries of interdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary. One of our artists has dreamed up a series where he has dancers collaborating with chefs, with virtual reality superstars and with recording artists and visual artists. But in these collaborations, you can find the dancers exploring new dimensions of their artistry. And as far as the revenue and the monetization of all of this, we also see dancers, of course, and other artists developing merchandise, teaching private classes. I think that there's so many ways in which these artists are being scrappy and entrepreneurial that we can learn from as organizations, but also that we can support and amplify and encourage, because I think that it's a time, again, for experimentation, and that's across artistic disciplines, but that's also across business models and business opportunities.
And you just answered actually a question that just came in from David Bellingham, but I would like to maybe pivot that over to Sue Hare. So David Bellingham from the Sotheby's Institute here in the UK was asking about, do you think that living fine artists, so the Grayson Perrys of the world, who we've been seeing a lot of here wonderfully through this period, do you think that living fine artists could also be used creatively, as with ballet dancers, to join with galleries in creating digital content and ideas? Have you been seeing any of that, Sue Hare, with that you can speak to?
So yeah, so if they're interested, so I think this is like a great time for that kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, because firstly, like, people have time, and secondly, again, if you're doing stuff online in the digital space, it requires less of the materiality. One thing we haven't touched upon is actually sustainability, and how museums actually can use this time to reposition themselves in terms of how much transport, movement, material sort of transition is happening. So for sure, I think incredible artists like Grayson Perry, but sort of even less famous, less well-established artists can use this opportunity to find their own voice in a new platform, on a new medium. I think probably the thing that we are going to think about now in terms of artists, dancers, and the public is this idea of accessibility. Some of the most interesting content that we've had on the Google Arts and Culture platform over the years is when you go behind the scenes with the curator or the archaeologist, you hear their story. Sometimes they're quite quirky. They're people who are usually quite shy. You might not necessarily have met them yourself in real life. You're going behind the scenes with them. And here we have a chance to do that. So I think that, of course, Grayson Perry will produce some kind of masterpiece no matter what medium he uses, but what if you could go in and meet and connect with in a different way and find access because there is this digital world? So I think that's another space which we need to think about. You go to an exhibition, you come away having seen what's been presented to you. You don't go into the storage facilities. You don't learn the stories of what went wrong, what's broken, what was never fixed. And that's where I think there's a chance to bring people to these websites to say, here's a different world that we didn't have time or space to show you before. And equally here, meet the artist and get to know them in a different way, or collaborate with them. They don't have to be the master in the conversation. You might be sharing something with Grayson Perry if you're a scientist or an engineer and you want to collaborate through this museum. I mean, I think there's many opportunities there. And I assume people like Grayson Perry, he's a great example, who love doing new things, will be open to bold collaborations for the future. And it doesn't just have to be the outcome. It doesn't have to be what's on the website. It can be the process as much as that.
I totally agree with that. I'm obsessed by museum storage. And it was a big part of my policy portfolio. And I was struck very much when I went on a visit to Liverpool, and my private secretary and I were shown the storage facilities of the Museum of Liverpool. And on the train back, she said that was the most exciting visit I've been on with you, which says something about the kind of visits I was normally doing. But the point was, she loved the informality of the storage site. She could walk past an Egyptian mummy with the curator, and it would be just kind of lying on a table. And the Science Museum has this amazing storage site on an airfield in Swindon. And I've always said to them, why the hell is this not open to the public? People love that. And it says something about the arts and what digital can bring to the arts, that the arts can sometimes be very, very intimidating, particularly for people who haven't kind of grown up with it. And kind of walking past those Doric columns of a museum or whatever is sometimes very difficult, and digital can bring that massive informality to bear. And if you're talking about monetization, I was thinking about, artists have websites like Patreon now and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity to monetize, but the real monetization is a kind of subscription model, potentially of the friends of, which museums, again, often the friends of often sit in a dusty corner and not really forgotten about, and they get a kind of glossy magazine every 6 months. But imagine, access to an exclusive digital channel where you get these interviews, you get taken to the storage site, you get to be taken through the process of the restoration of a painting. You get to watch rehearsals live. You really feel a member of the club with exclusive access, and in return, you're giving money to the organization to help sustain it. So there's a whole, newspapers are beginning to do this and win. The New York Times is winning now with subscriptions, and there is a way for museums and performing arts organizations to potentially, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and I'm not saying it could be done overnight, to win through digital with subscriptions.
And we're also seeing, but keep in mind, you guys, this week is the Frieze Art Fair is opening, right?
Yeah.
And both Frieze and Basel have been going through this, and it's even interesting to see how the banks, how is Deutsche Bank then taking that in the digital world to the next step to engage with their clients and create something extra special, as Suhair is saying, or Kara is saying, to really, really reach out and use this. And it's interesting when you look at the firms like Julie's Bicycle that go in and do this, look at sustainability within our orgs, write the plans around this, how, in the future we might move into, as Suhair is saying, this hybrid model. The fair won't go away. We all want our fairs back. They're fantastic. And what they do for our local and cultural economy, it's fantastic. But having this hybrid model where we have the access, where it's far more sustainable, that's exciting. Andrea, I want to hand over to you.
I was just going to add on the back of Ed's discussion, which I found really interesting, is that one of the best projects that we are able to support is the Art Conservation Project. And some of the, for me, in the last 15 years, the most thrilling moments of art have been going with the conservationists into the studios where they're doing their conserving and learning about the story behind the story. So the picture that you see hanging at the Musée d'Orsay wasn't necessarily like that. And the first couple of drafts and the history that goes along with that, because then when you look at the painting, it's a whole nother view of why the artist did it. And there's, we've done a few of those restorations in situ, where people who had purchased tickets and were in the museum were able to watch the conservation happening. Those have been hugely successful. So if we take those out of the studios and onto digital and do more with that, I think people will just get so much more out of their art. I mean, it's a really interesting way to approach the subject.
Well, I think we've come to our close. Can I thank all of you? Cara, thank you for getting up at 4:30 in the morning. And
only for you, Susan.
Okay, thank you for deciding you wanted to join the gang for this part of the discussion. Suhair, thank you for everything you brought from the world of tech. Andrea, from banking, but specifically where our banks and our financial institutions are going with ESG and how that ties into what you guys are doing within our communities. You guys are all part of the change in your own special way. And audience, thanks for tuning in and keep leaning into this, guys. We're getting there. We're getting there. Take care and have a gorgeous day. Bye-bye.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.